For the majority of fighting game players, online mode is where they're going to have clocked most of their hours. But the original and arguably better way to experience fighting games is offline, in person. In the first golden age of fighting games, the versus modes you would find in home console ports of the arcade games were originally intended as a play with friends and family option. But nowadays, while house sessions are still a thing, fighting game developers need to realize that 99% of the time a game spends in versus mode is going to be at an offline fighting game event. And catering to this environment, which you should as a developer if you're organizing world tours, requires different considerations that make the experience of running and attending fighting game events more or less enjoyable. This is the last entry in this mini-series of quality of life features developers should copy from each other. I'm focusing on features that already exist in some fighting games, but which are unfortunately not universal yet. Let's get into it. As I mentioned, the overwhelming majority of the time, versus mode is going to be used at offline locals and tournaments. There are some expectations that come with such an environment. First of all, you want the various machines running the games, the setups as we call them, to be in a known, predictable and repeatable condition. That's easy to tell when the last patch came with a new character, but that's not always the case, so it's nice when the title screen shows the game version, like in Granblue or Tekken. Once you know you're on the right version, there might be other things you need to check. For instance, you might want to make sure that the round timer or the number of rounds required to win a match are as specified in the event rule set, or you might want to turn some options on or off and make sure they stay that way. Some games have a tournament mode where a whole set of such options can be set with the flick of a switch. Tekken 8 and SF6 are examples of games with such mode, which by the way didn't exist on release, so you know that it can be added after the fact. As an example of tournament mode features, the etiquette when playing on stream is to let the intro roll. It looks cool, it gives production time to queue up the overlays, and commentators space to yap. Being able to disable intro-outro skipping is a nice option for stream setup, and that's something I will usually turn on for brackets. In a similar vein, many tournament rules state that opening the pause menu mid-match will result in an instant round loss. But sometimes people be pressing the start button without thinking. I often find myself pressing it reflexively, hoping it will skip the cinematic for the super I just got hit by. Tournament modes often disable the pause button, but I prefer when the pause button is still available behind a long press, as there are sometimes legitimate reasons to go back to character select or main menu once a match has started. Another thing I like to see is a tally of the score, at the victory screen if not in the match. It is very common for people to lose track of where they are in the set, even on stream.
Wait, what? I'm pretty sure it was 2 games. Huh?
I'm pretty sure it was 2 games.
It was 2 games. You haven't won yet. What are you standing up for?
Wait.
So it's nice to get a win counter, like you see in Unit 2 for instance. However, most games don't reset the score unless you go back to main menu. Strive will do it on character change, but that can also cause confusion when, well, someone changes character. Granblue has an option to solve this problem by letting you set a rematch limit, which will also display the game win count for each player at the bottom of the screen. The only issue is that option gets reset whenever you go back to main menu, which players often do to deal with controller shenanigans. In my opinion, the award for best tournament mode goes to SF6. You can lock the match settings, you can set a rematch limit, you get an overlay for score tally that even highlights who's on set point. I wouldn't use it on the stream setup, but for Overstation it might be useful for the reasons I mentioned before. And even if you don't set a rematch limit, there is a great but terribly named menu option that resets the score tally and sends you back to the side selection screen. You also get the option to auto-randomize stages on rematch and remove stages from the rotation, which might be useful if you need to ban stages for performance reasons or otherwise. But it's good to have the option to still manually select things, as sometimes you need to go back to a specific game state after technical issues or controller disconnection. Speaking of which, the other big consideration when building an event-friendly versus mode is the fact that generally, a setup will see dozens if not hundreds of people bringing their own controllers and wanting their own key bindings, so the game should account for it. Probably the most important is to handle connection and more critically disconnection of controllers. Tekken 8 for instance tends to get omega confused about which controller is player 1 and which one is player 2 if controllers have been disconnected on the victory screen, to the point where people often have to go back to main menu and re-enter versus mode. And it's worse on PS5 than on PC because the game tries to be clever by remembering which profile was P1 and which was P2, but people rarely pick the correct one because they often can't tell which one it is. Or worse, if one player disconnects but the other stays, the game is basically soft-locked as the remaining player cannot navigate away from the victory screen unless they plug a second controller in or close the game. This is a good example of a case where being too prescriptive causes problems. You see, most rule sets only allow the loser of a match to change character, and Tekken sort of tries to enforce that by giving control of the post-match menu to the loser only. But if they fuck off the setup, then the other person gets stuck. In this specific case, both issues can mostly be prevented by waiting to go back to character select before unplugging, but people never do it. I know I should do it, and I still forget half the time. Probably the most bulletproof way of handling it is by giving both players a menu on the victory screen, and by having the change character option send you all the way back to side selection, like Strive does. It does mean an extra step on character change, but I think it's worth the trade-off. On the topic of side selection screen, the traditional version with the list of controllers in the middle is in my opinion the best one, even if sometimes it looks a bit silly and potentially confusing to see more than 2 controllers listed without knowing which is which. But finding out takes like half a second, whereas in Tekken, while they do avoid these by asking players to press start in order, they're asking people playing a 1v1 game to coordinate. And when a mistake inevitably happens, round tripping back to side selection takes more time than with the traditional screen. If one player didn't get a chance to pick a side, then you can do like Granblue and have them just press the start button to join as a second player, which is enabled by the fact that this game doesn't have different modes for player versus player and player versus CPU. Once players have picked a side, the first thing they'll usually do is change their controller bindings. Although this is a mostly solved problem in fighting games, I should point out that a well-designed character select screen makes the input binding screen a per-player thing that doesn't obscure the character selections, so one player can do their bindings while the other one can pick a character or vice versa. Oh, by the way, please let people change binding from any character select screen, not just versus mode. Looking at you, Tekken 8. What Tekken does do well with controller setup though, is this thing where after changing a bind, it will automatically move you to the next command, so you can enter all your bind as a quick sequence of buttons, rather than having to go down in the menu, press A, press the desired button, and repeat, which can and does lead to binding mistakes. Granblue also does that automatic advance, but only on PS5, not on PC. Why? Oh, also, if you design a controller binding screen, please make it so that you define the button for the action and not the action for the button. It's much more intuitive that way. And I'm glad to see that VF5 Revo made that change in the World Stage update. Another thing Granblue does well with input customization is the ability to disable bindings entirely, such as specific super inputs, dash macros, and motion inputs. I'm not gonna get in the debate of motion inputs versus simple inputs. My point here is that when the game gives you several ways of inputting one command, being able to disable the ones you won't use is nice. It reduces the risks of misinput. But if you do that, the game needs to give you clear information that some stuff has been disabled, so the next person hopping on the setup doesn't accidentally end up playing with only half of their controls. I turn off motion inputs for specials in Granblue, so if you play after me on the setup, you better do a button check. Speaking of which, there shouldn't be a newly released fighting game where the players have to start a match to check their buttons. I know some people have trust issues and want to see the buttons do the move they expect in the actual game, but even so, a button check screen on the controller setup menu is the bare minimum. The other thing about controls is that different platforms have different amounts of input latency, and some people are sensitive enough to it that it might fuck with their combos. Many games will let you adjust input delay, but Strive gives you a rhythm game style input delay tester. I've only ever seen one person use it, but I like the idea as it allows people to confirm whether the delay they're setting is actually appropriate for the setup they're playing on. And one last thing I want to mention, which is minor quality of life thing for event organizer and spectators. As I said at the beginning, if you make a fighting game, someone will run a tournament for it. And if there's a tournament, there's probably gonna be a stream, and if there's a stream, there's gonna be score overlays. So it's nice when the game's HUD makes reasonable accommodation for these, so that there's a spot to put this overlay without obscuring any other information. For instance, I like when the character's name is displayed on the HUD because it's always nice for a new spectator to see who's who, especially if the character catches their attention. So it's nice when it's placed somewhere that it's unlikely to be under an overlay. For instance, inside the health bar like in Strive, or below it like in Tekken. Although we're getting outside of the game, 2xKO generously offers a template with safe zones, so you can design your overlay without needing to find out which fuse has the longest name, for instance. And that's gonna wrap up this series. As you've seen over the past few episodes, there are quite a few good ideas that are scattered across the genre. If you see a feature you think is cool but doesn't exist in your game of choice, I encourage you to, politely, ask the devs to consider implementing it. Some of those were added post-launch, so it can be done. The community just needs to be vocal enough about the value of those features. If you're developing a fighting game, I hope these lists will be useful as references when you find the time to work on user experience. And if I missed anything you think was worth mentioning, please let us know in the comment, and feel free to suggest your ideas for QL features that no fighting games has implemented yet.